The following is a presentation from the 8th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College. Together Apart, creating spaces for understanding and reimagining society. Due to the 2020 pandemic, all presentations were conducted through Zoom. To learn more about Humanities Days at Montgomery College and to access other program recordings, please go to this website.
Thankfully, because of Humanities Days, I do have this opportunity to talk about some of the material that I've been collecting, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And I'll bring up my PowerPoint in just a moment as well. But so my subject is looted art. And there's a lot to say about that, and it's something that's hard to narrow down. But I will give it a somewhat focus from about the 18th century into the 20th century. But I'll make some references to other things. So this is a different discussion from the heist of the Mona Lisa in 1911. By an employee at the Louvre, a half-crazed Italian nationalist. I mean, that's a whole story in itself. And it's not the same as the theft of Edvard Munch's iconic Scream and his Madonna from the Oslo Museum by fortune hunters in 1994. Another good story, but I want to focus on this idea of state-sponsored looting, and especially some of the long-term consequences of that, long after it's come to an end. I won't have time now, and maybe we can talk about it at the end, deal with the recent desecration and pillaging of ancient Mesopotamian art by ISIS. Although that's more connected to another subject, iconoclasm, or the destruction of art by extremists. But this particular presentation was inspired by a series of articles that Sarah Ducey sent me, and actually I have them, some of them here. Every so often, Sarah will send me articles of interest from the New York Times and other periodicals in printed form, and send them by campus mail, and it gives me something physical and tangible to read and think about. And there were a number of these articles, and also by a former student of mine, John Daniel, who, very engaging gentleman, took one of my art history classes, and who, after for the last, up until we had to leave campus, would drop off copies of the New York Times art section in my mailbox. So nice. I was kept up to date on what's going on in the New York art scene, but which is all another way of saying how important it is to keep reading and thinking about things, and also how timely it is. These articles keep coming out about Nazi era looted art, which is still in dispute. It keeps coming up again and again and again, 75 plus years later. And that's one of the things that I'm going to be talking about. But I also want to give a wider view by talking about things, a little bit about the looting that went on under Napoleon, the Elgin Marble controversy between United Kingdom and Greece, sort of an ongoing thing, a controversy concerning the artworks from Nigeria, the Benin Bronzes, many of which are in the British Museum, but in other parts of the world, and what should happen with those. a painting that's in the Metropolitan Museum that most people have ignored, but has a sort of shady past that's coming to light. And even the fact that there's a lot of Dutch art that was stolen by the Nazis in World War II and is in Polish museums, and what to do with those, as well as something I came across just a week or so ago, again, just as a reminder that it keeps coming up, about a German Jewish family who had their art confiscated by the Nazis, and one of the paintings turned up in a small museum in upstate New York just this past year. So maybe we'll have time to talk about all of these, but we'll see if we can get to it all. Okay, so again, our subject is the looted art from Napoleon to the Nazis, and that title, "Will It Ever Be Returned?" again, is one of the things I want to be discussing in terms of some resolutions, because there's a lot of these thorny issues. Sometimes it's clear cut. This work was stolen by so and so, and it belongs to so and so, but it's usually a lot more complicated than that, and especially after so much time has gone by. And my subtitle is related to that article that I mentioned about the Benin Bronzes in the British Museum, and the title of the article from January of this year is "Will These Treasures Ever Go Home?" And it's a wide open issue. The looting of art, as you might imagine, goes back to the dawn of civilization. As I like to say, if the cave paintings were not nailed down, they probably would have gotten stolen too. But basically, the kind of theft, the kind of looting that I'm talking about is, presupposes having institutions. That is, it is a part of civilization. An early example is the stela of Hammurabi, the ancient Babylonian king, and which had his famous law code on it, was carried off after a war with the Elamites in the 12th century BCE. Was rediscovered in 1901 by a French archaeologist working in what's now Iran, and ended up in the Louvre Museum. The ancient Romans might be able to lay claim to the dubious honor of being the first to practice systematic looting of artifacts on the level of an entire culture. And that goes back to the 2nd century BCE, when they conquered Greece. Original bronze statues created by the Greeks were melted down to make weapons, but not before Roman artists made numerous copies in marble. And the way many, in a sense, famous Greek statues have survived, besides being documentation related to them, is through the fact that the Romans made copies. So if you go to the archaeological museum in Naples, in southern Italy, you'll find an awful lot of these Roman copies of Greek statues. These copies of Greek masterworks were ended up decorating Roman palaces and villas and temples, which to the Romans, they might have looked at it as though they were paying tribute to Greek artistry by copying it. There's no question that there was very mixed feelings. The Romans had a love-hate relationship with the Greeks. They admired them and despised them at the same time, destroyed their art, but copied it and honored it. And that's, again, a sort of strange sort of tribute. Skipping ahead to the late 18th century and the era of the wars coming out of the French Revolution. Napoleon Napoleon Bonaparte became the Emperor of France. And indeed, the French revolutionary government, known as the Directory, that preceded him, were very much in the habit of claiming art as spoils of war. And this was something that was often confirmed in treaties with rulers that ended some of these little wars. Wherever French armies went from 1796 to 1815, they seized or destroyed artworks, partly in the name of celebrating liberty. That is, they saw it as freeing the artwork from reactionaries, anti-revolutionaries, or they also saw it as liberating art from superstition. And by that, they meant the Catholic Church. And these types of seizures took place in Belgium and Holland and Italy and Germany and Austria and Spain and Egypt. One particularly infamous episode involved using the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, the home of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, as a stable. And as I like to tell my students, horses don't appreciate art very much. Artworks, which were sometimes looted on an individual level and other times brought back to Paris. And one person who was also in on this was Josephine Bonaparte, the wife of Napoleon and the Empress, who obtained one of the best jewelry collections in Europe, which he kept at her private villa at Malmaison outside of Paris. The biggest prizes were taken to the Louvre, which became this, the former royal palace and the largest museum in the world, but became this sort of storehouse of all these treasures that the French conquest led to. And that was part of Napoleon's idea of, inspiring French people with the idea of glory, la gloire. And that was a kind of excuse for taking lots and lots of art. One such painting, and actually go ahead here, that was obtained by French armies was a 20 by 30 foot high painting by Paolo Veronese, a late Italian Renaissance master, the Wedding at Cana. The painting is so big and so hard to move that the French soldiers who took it cut it in half and brought it back to Paris, where it still remains. After the war, French curators at the Louvre claimed it was too big and too fragile to move, and that it should stay in France. Monastery, where it was originally from, San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. Again, Venice was conquered by Napoleon, who ended its formal independence after more than 750 years. And so in the monastery a few years ago, to celebrate the 210th anniversary of the painting being taken from the site, posted a full-size digital version of the painting on the wall, with incredible precision, to remind everyone where it was and to give a sense of its history. But it's still in Paris and is very likely to stay. But I did want to say that after the fall of Napoleon in 1815 and the Congress of Vienna, which included the victorious powers, decreed much of the stolen art go back to its place of origin, or if that was not possible, to provide compensation for the owners. And in fact, 5,233 works of art went back. Today, there's not too much in the way, with the exception of maybe Veronese's painting, of residual grievances about Napoleon's plunder of art. So in a way, much changed hands, much smaller scale than later under the Nazis, as we'll see. But it was, for the most part, sorted out afterwards, and there hasn't been too much grumbling about it. And again, the Mona Lisa is a separate story, and that actually was not a case of plunder, but that Leonardo da Vinci, who lived his last years in France and gave the painting, the Mona Lisa, in his will to the French royal government. So that one actually belongs. There was not the same resolution with the saga of the Elgin Marbles, which were obtained and involved England during the same period, from 1801 to 1805. And again, while Napoleon mostly stole, I guess I should say, pun intended, stole the show, the British were also taking art during this time, including works that were originally taken by Napoleon in Egypt. And when the British took over Egypt, when the French army surrendered to them, they took the artworks that the French had. British noblemen and amateur archaeologists, and that meant in the 19th century a treasure hunter, Lord Elgin was a diplomat to the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Greece in the early 19th century. And he used his position to acquire statues and other artifacts, especially from the Parthenon in Athens, up on the hill of the Acropolis. And he acquired about half of the relief sculptures, the friezes, which decorated the upper sides of the Parthenon, and a number of the larger statues, and you can see the group of 3 of them here, that decorated the pediments, among other things. And he brought them back to England, and eventually his heirs sold them to the British government, and who have since displayed them in the British Museum in London. A very popular tourist attraction. Greece declared its independence in 1821, so less than a generation later, and their independence was firmly established by 1832. And it's been a desire almost immediately since independence for the Greek government to regain those statues and all the sculptures and other art. One argument that was put forward for many years by the museum, by the British Museum, the British state, is that Greece did not have adequate facilities, and we'll hear more about that excuse, to display and take care of the artifacts. Since 2009, Athens boasts the Acropolis Museum, in part built to accommodate the Elgin hoard. Nevertheless, the British Museum has not budged and even rejected an offer of mediation by UNESCO. The Greek government, despite some threatening gestures, has chosen not to pursue legal action in an international court or other venues, which might not have succeeded and would have been a kind of national embarrassment. But then there's also the political issues because Greece didn't want to have a conflict with one of its NATO allies in the UK. View example of one of those friezes, these sort of exquisite sculptures from classical period Greece. And we have to ask ourselves, this is something that goes back to the 19th century and still continues today, is what is the legal thing to do? What is the ethical thing to do? And more importantly, or ultimately, what is the right thing to do about the Elgin Marbles? And these are complex questions that get to issues like, to whom does the art belong and where should it be? Where should it go? Now, Lord Elgin technically did not steal the statues. He did receive permission from the Ottoman government, although what's not totally clear is, he sort of took, he took his permission to mean he could just take absolutely everything in any quantity, and it's not totally clear that he had that kind of freedom to do that. But it would be fair to say, though, that if the sculptures and the artworks had stayed in Athens, they might not have survived as a result of neglect and vandalism. And I'll keep coming back to this idea again: is there a reasonable compromise to be had? Is there some way where nobody has to lose face, and both sides can feel somewhat satisfied, with the result? And that's for now, that's a question we'll take up later. So moving on to another not very admirable episode in the late 19th century, the so-called British punitive expedition of 1897. This took place in what's now southern Nigeria, and what used to be the independent Benin Kingdom. Some of the geography can be a little bit confusing because there's a country today called the Republic of Benin, which was inspired by the glory of the Benin Kingdom, but the Republic of Benin was not part of the kingdom, and there's Benin City and the surrounding areas are in Nigeria today. But in any case, in the late 1890s, the Benin Kingdom had sort of fallen on hard times, and England was the major power in the region. And there had been some, sort of diplomacy and conversations between the British and the ruling family. The king was known as an Oba. And there was an episode in 1897 where a British consul wanted to meet with the Oba, was asked not to do so at that moment because there was a religious festival going on. He went anyway, and his party was attacked and with much loss of life. The immediate response was a raid of 1,200 soldiers led by a British admiral, which stormed the Benin City and captured the royal palace complex. And the palace, and there were many buildings, and the related shrines were systematically looted. And you can see from this often cited and illustrated scene, it shows the soldiers in the aftermath where they just simply came in and took literally whatever they found, cleaning out ancestor shrines with carved ivory tusks, bronze statues, brass plaques were pried off the walls of the palace, and literally an enormous amount of loot. The booty was brought back to England. Some of it was kept by individual soldiers as sort of keepsakes. The most impressive artworks went to the British Museum, including the so-called Benin Bronzes. It's a sample of them. There are actually 900 of them. And it's, I put the word bronze in quotes because they're actually not made of bronze. They're cast brass. But bronze somehow sounds more impressive, and that's how they're referred to in the article. And for a long time, they've been the Benin Bronzes. So they went to the British Museum, and lots of other objects, but many of these artifacts were sold off to private collections and museums around the Western world. So what a mess in terms of trying to bring it all back together. The New York Times article on the subject from early in the year, recounts a history of the looting of Benin art, and that's just something I talk about in my African art history class when I look at art from that region. But the real interesting part of the story is the effort by two British police officers, one of whom was originally from Nigeria, to facilitate the return of the Benin Bronzes and other artifacts taken in 1897. There had been some efforts for a few decades to achieve some kind of restitution, and sort of passions were inflamed by an incident in 1977 when the British Museum demanded that the local sort of government, local museum in Lagos, which wanted to borrow an ivory mask for a festival of art and culture, the British Museum was demanding a $3 million insurance policy. Again, the British rationale up to that point with Benin art, and indeed with Greek art, has often been, quote, "We are looking after it. If you had been looking after it, it would have been stolen by now." A kind of patronizing approach. So these two police officers met a man, Mark Walker, a man in his 70s, who was the grandson of Captain Herbert Walker, who took part in the punitive expedition. And in his journal, Captain Walker recounted that all the stuff of any value found in the king's palace and surrounding houses has been collected. Clearly that was a planned enterprise. This didn't just happen randomly, and these soldiers all had the proper tools as well. But the current Mr. Walker went to Nigeria not long ago to meet the current Oba, the ruler now. Again, the Oba, there is a royal family today, but they're figureheads. They have a lot of prestige among local people, but not real political authority. But Mr. Walker went to visit the Oba, and he returned two objects taken by his grandfather, two small sculptures. His belief about art is, and I quote, in terms of these looted objects, they should just go back. It's the right thing to do. And sometimes when I read that, I get chills, because normally feelings that get involved and history and back and forth, that it's rare when you can just cut to the chase and someone just says it. Another statement that he made gets at a possible solution or compromise. The British Museum should use modern technology to make perfect casts of its whole collection and send all the originals back. You wouldn't know the difference. Or vice versa. I don't think it's so simple as that, but certainly, there's questions, about the real thing and not the real thing. It's true that in many cases, if museums, and some museums actually do this, put out some works that we think are the real ones, which are actually not. I actually had that experience in Italy, where a number of former shrine of San Michele in Florence, or San Michele, there were a number of statues in niches around the outside of the building by famous artists like Donatello and Verrocchio and Ghiberti and others, but those are copies. The originals are actually inside. And again, most people can't tell the difference, but certainly, I suppose if that was done quietly, it could help. The Benin Bronzes, as I mentioned, are not actually bronze, they're brass. And they represent a very popular attraction at the British Museum, along with the Elgin Marbles and other things. They include images of rulers, soldiers, officials, foreigners, and others, and they were displayed on the walls of the royal palace. Something else that was very appealing to the soldiers who looted the Benin Palace were carved ivory objects. And of course, that connects to another issue, contemporary issue about obtaining ivory by killing elephants. But ivory carving was a great specialty of Benin artists going back some 500 years or more. And they were in great demand, both domestically and abroad. The Portuguese merchants who were trading with the Edo people in Benin were very fond of the carved ivory objects. Images of the Queen Mother, the Ioba, were quite common. This particular one is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York and is not under dispute as far as I know. And it was something that, as a sign of respect for the Queen Mother, images of the Ioba was worn on the belt of the kings when they went into battle. Only there hasn't been a concerted effort to handle Benin objects on the larger scale. For now, it's only individuals like Mr. Walker, was a history with the punitive raid, are returning things. Like in Greece, although in Athens there already is a museum, but Benin City is building a new museum, which is scheduled to be finished in 2023. And there's another issue, building a museum. There's a museum in Egypt, the Grand Egyptian Museum, which is being built in Giza near the pyramids, which is supposed to be a state-of-the-art facility. That might embolden the Egyptian government to ask for their statue of Nefertiti back from the museum in Berlin. But again, you have these new museums. So the Benin Museum is scheduled to be finished, but there's no guarantee that will lead to any results. And there are other problems and complexities as well. Again, as I mentioned, there's the Benin royal family and their interests. There's the Nigerian state government, and they don't always have the same interests as the Benin royal family, and so that makes it harder. There has been some discussion, again, when this museum opens in a few years, to loan 300 of the bronzes to the new museum for 3 years with the option to renew. And this includes the British Museum and also museums in Vienna and Berlin. But does this idea of sharing, which seems pretty reasonable, does that go far enough? Does it represent closure of some sort, or whatever that means? So the Benin story takes us to the end of the 19th century, but the state-sponsored looting of art was only just getting started in the 20th century. The majestic Ghent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck, painted by Jan van Eyck and carved by his brother Hubert in the 15th century, is sort of a case in point about what was going to send shockwaves through the art world in Europe. Interestingly, parts of it were pilfered under Napoleon and then brought back to St. Bavo Cathedral in Ghent after the Napoleonic Wars. During the First World War, large areas of Belgium, including Ghent, were occupied by the German army. And again, panels, and you can see it's a polyptych, it's an altarpiece with many separate pieces and separate paintings. So the German army in World War I took many of the panels and brought them back to Germany. At the end of World War I, they were sent back to Belgium. And then when Germany occupied Belgium again in World War II, the altarpiece was seized on Hitler's personal orders in 1942. They were recovered almost miraculously where they were stashed in a salt mine, and a little bit worse for wear by the famous Monuments Men, that unit in sort of embedded in the American Army, which was to try to rescue artworks in the closing days of World War II. And there's a movie, somewhat glamorized movie about them. And that was just a preview of what was going to happen around World War II and art. The scale of the Nazi theft is staggering. Though, of course, certainly, compared to Napoleon and others, though, of course, it pales in comparison to the genocidal policies against the enemies of the Third Reich. After the war, hundreds of thousands of objects, and no one knows for sure how many, but at least 500,000 were identified as looted by the Nazi regime. And again, that doesn't account for ones that were destroyed. But this continent-wide plundering began well before the war with the advent of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany in 1933. It is well known, a failed artist, rejected by the Architecture Academy in Vienna more than once while a young man, yet he fancied himself a connoisseur, and that had fateful consequences for artists, collectors, and art institutions alike during the era from 1933 to 1945. Under Hitler's guidance, art was divided into two parts. That's how the Nazis saw it. The first was known as Great German Art, that is Großdeutsche Kunstausstellung, which tended to be realistic, traditional folk art, what many scholars would tend to see as sort of middlebrow and mediocre. And then the second type of art was seen as degenerate art, Entartete Kunst, which tended to be modern, that is 20th century art, more abstract, more expressionistic, and to the Nazis, full of foreign influences, dangerous influences. Interestingly enough, the Nazis held separate competing art shows in 1937, starting in Munich. That is, you had galleries with the official art, officially acceptable art, and then galleries with the degenerate art. And the degenerate art, the entartete Kunst, tended to draw much bigger crowds. No one knows exactly why that is. There wasn't a free press by then in Germany. Certainly, the idea of scandal certainly brings a big turnout, and that was true in the famous Paris Salon of 1863, the show of the rejected art, the Salon des Refusés, in which Manet's Luncheon on the Grass achieved such notoriety. So there may have been some of that, or maybe people liked modern art better. In 1939, 5,000 artworks that appeared in the Degenerate exhibition were taken to Berlin and burned. So part of the idea that the Nazis had is they had to, and again, sort of fateful for how they would deal with people they didn't like, would destroy art. The rest, and this was telling as well, either was sold abroad or secretly kept by art dealers employed by the Nazis, as we'll see. This, in some sense, shows that greed often triumphed over ideology, or sometimes. But one of the things the Nazis learned was that art was a very useful was a very useful form of hard currency, especially when the war started. It was, most international forums were not going to deal directly with the Nazis. So selling art, even stolen art, was one way to do things. When the war broke out in late 1939, German armies soon conquered much of Europe, and looting was no longer restricted to German museums, but also extended to conquered territories, which was fueled in part by Hitler's desire to avenge Germany's defeat in World War I, and to fill up a newly conceived gigantic Führer museum in Linz, Austria, his hometown. And the idea was that it was supposed to surpass the Louvre, to be to surpass France and to be the new great art museum of German glory. But the project was never realized. Certainly was thought about a lot, and there were many drawings. The plundering, however, of European art was systematic, and involved several organizations that were tasked to do this. Although, as with was true of many organizations, the Nazis created, military or otherwise, were competing with each other, and these organizations were led by prominent and rapacious Nazis such as Hermann Göring, Alfred Rosenberg, Joachim von Ribbentrop, future war criminals, who were involved in foreign affairs and the Air Force and propaganda. They were supposed to give Hitler the choicest objects they acquired, but Göring fancied himself a collector and kept at least 21,000 artworks for himself. And he was making expeditions in person and through his emissaries to obtain art. All this while the war was going on. These art thieves, official art thieves, took things from public museums when possible. It wasn't always possible because museums like the Louvre hid most of their collections, but they were particularly rapacious when it came to private collections belonging to those who fled, but particularly those belonging to Jews. Sometimes small amounts of money were paid, and that was usually in the era before the war started, but more often than not, artworks were seized. And the fact that articles about individual artworks keep appearing with stubborn regularity these days about revealing thorny issues related to Nazi stolen art attests to the scale of their looting and the difficulty of resolving who owns what. And I wanted to, a little bit quickly, talk about a few of these cases that have been in the news in the last 10 years, and in particular, and particularly in the past year. Perhaps the most interesting case came to light in 2012. And that's when German tax authorities raided the Munich apartment of Cornelius Gurlitt on suspicion of tax evasion. It turned out that Gurlitt was not cheating on his taxes, but what the officials found who came to his apartment, they found 1,500 artworks in a pretty small apartment that had belonged to his father, Hildebrand Gurlitt, who had died in 1956 and who had worked as an art dealer under the Nazis. He amassed a collection of his own, some of it under questionable circumstances. The collection involved old master paintings, modern paintings, drawings, and prints, many of the sort that the Nazi leadership destroyed or wanted to get rid of, like, for instance, Paul Signac's Quai de Clichy, a late 19th century French pointillist painting. After the war, Hildebrand Gurlitt convinced the Allies that all the artworks belonged to him and that all the relevant documentation had been destroyed in the bombing of Dresden. That's a good excuse, but probably not true. The investigation was still in progress. Cornelius died in 2014, and he left his entire collection in his will to the Modern Art Museum in Bern, Switzerland. After many court battles, the transfer of the art was allowed to take place, minus about 500 artworks which stayed in Germany that were suspected to have been looted. In the interim, some works have been restored to their owners, like the Signac painting to a French realtor, Gaston Levy. Henri Matisse's Woman Sitting in an Armchair, which belonged to the Paul Rosenberg, a Jewish art dealer. And again, these were given back to family members, ones that could be found. Another artwork where it's not clear where it belongs is a beautiful watercolor painting by Franz Marc, German artist, Horses and Landscape. He died German, who died fighting in World War I, but the Nazis looked on his work unfavorably, although much of it survived. Since 2017, there have been several exhibitions of the Gurlitt hoard in Germany, Switzerland, and Israel to try to find the descendants of owners, or if people would recognize the work, but it must be said, without a lot of success. And there was another exhibition in 2019 in Jerusalem in the Israel Museum of 110 objects from the collection called Fateful Choices, Art from the Gurlitt Trove. So what happens next? Should they continue to be exhibited, or should these artworks take their place in public and private collections like any regular artwork whose provenience is not questioned? There's that, is there a debt that has to be paid in terms of remembering the history of the artwork? Another case mentioned in an article earlier this year is called Finding Nazi Looted Art in Poland. Again, something you might not think about, but the problem is that a number of Dutch artworks that belonged to Jewish collectors and others were looted by the Nazis during the war, were taken to German-occupied Poland, and then after the war ended up in Polish museums. One example is this 17th century painting by Jan van Goyen, sort of peaceful huts on a canal. But again, the history of what happened to the work is not peaceful. It belonged to a gallerist, Jacques Goudsticker, who had a gallery in Amsterdam, and he fled the city in 1940 and was killed in a aerial bombing. It's not clear how the painting got to Poland, and particularly the Dansk National Museum, but it's been there for decades. Poland, of course, has suffered very heavily during World War II, losing 20% of its pre-war population, and that included 3 million Polish Jews, and is still seeking the return of more than 63,000 art and cultural objects. But the Polish state is less enthusiastic about returning the property of other countries' citizens. To quote a Dansk law professor, the Polish government wants to have as much as possible back, but they don't want to give anything back to others, which is, of course, a complicated and frustrating issue. A 2018 study lists 81 works taken from the Netherlands that ended up in Poland, and 7 are in the Dansk Art Museum. Some of this reluctance to return paintings by Jan van Goyen, Peter de Hooch, Jacob van Riesdaal, and other 17th century masters stems from a lack of organization, research, and effort. But from the Polish government on down, there is still an attitude of victimization, that Poland lost millions of people, probably 500,000 cultural objects, and considers the alleged Dutch paintings to be a form of restitution. Research done in the Netherlands lists 15,000 objects still missing, including the ones in Poland, some of which would have been taken by Soviet troops who also believed in using art as reparations and restitutions. Many others were destroyed. How do we resolve this conundrum? One solution, as mentioned in the article, is transparency. Make information public about suspected stolen artworks as a first step, then set up a process to make claims for the return. That sounds great, but there has to be goodwill to make all of this work. I'm gonna make sure we have some time for questions. So let me skip ahead a little bit. One other case that I came across just in the last 2 weeks, and this was an article that was in CNN Culture Online on October 15th. And it was concerned with the collection of the Mossy family, family of German Jews who fled Germany soon after Hitler came to power, and whose art collection of some 1,200 works were looted by the Nazis. According to writer Christina Zidanowicz, this would be one of the first large expropriations undertaken by the Nazis for what would become, unfortunately, a well-oiled machine. Rudolf Mossy was a wealthy publisher, had a newspaper. He died in 1920, left his collection to his family. One of the works that he collected, he traveled, went to an art exhibition in Chicago in 1900, and he liked the painting by the American impressionist Gary Melchers, painting sometimes called skaters or winter or snow. Interestingly, there's when this article came to light, it was found that there was a copy of the painting, almost exactly the same subject and composition, but with some slightly different colors, that was in the collection of the museum in Philadelphia. And again, apparently he was, selling pretty well, and he was, asked to kind of churn out some of these paintings. But so the Rudolph Mossy bought the painting, and today it's worth several $100,000. And interestingly, the family left Germany in the late 1933, early 1934, and it happened that the painting was sold after it had been seized and ended up in the Arkell Museum in upstate New York, west of Albany, and it's been there since 1934. When the painting was recognized as being stolen by the Nazis, the museum turned it over to the FBI, who returned it to the family. And the Mossy family established in 2011 the so-called Mossy Art Restitution Project. And the idea is to try to find the 1,000+ artworks, and it shows you what a difficult process it is. About 50 paintings have been identified, about 35 have been returned. 8 more restitutions are in progress, involving works in Poland, Germany, Sweden, the US, and Israel. And it shows you how, or I should say that, that there's very many stolen works still remain in limbo. Efforts continue. Usually it's sort of the process sort of ebbs and flows, but as a measure of how much was stolen and how hard it is to undo these illicit efforts, and how difficult to find the heirs and families after more than 75 years. So what next? Where can we go from here with this difficult subject? I did come across, as one last point, and I can open things up, that there's a database, lootedart.com, the Central Registry of Information on Looted Cultural Property, 1933-1945, which lists artworks stolen from Jews during the 1930s and 40s, and contains more than 25,000 titles, although the actual number of works is probably much, much higher than that. It just gives you some idea of the scope of the problem.
There was a comment from Joseph O'Hare about a book on Egyptian artifacts and how the European countries grab their artifacts. He gives a link to that.
Oh, great.
We have actually Mary Sheriff has the comment about when you had mentioned about making exact duplicates, that we have the technology now to do copies, and then maybe to send the originals back home, or to, anyways, that's always the question, like who gets the real stuff. Yeah. But her comment is that at MC, at the Rockville campus, we have a sculpture called Stan the T-Rex that is a copy of a real dinosaur fossil. And she says that when she passes by, she never feels like it's just a copy. And so I actually feel very resonant with that, because when I go by Stan, I always feel, I marvel at him, and I will sit or I'll take another picture. I have a million pictures of Stan, and I do feel that, though I know very well that it is a replica, and I believe there's something like 25 of those.
Yeah.
That it feels that way. But she has an additional comment about countries should have at least a seat at the table in discussions about ownership, right? Mm-hmm. Anne Briggs notes that she saw an exhibit of art that was looted during the Holocaust at the Louvre in 2018 and found it very interesting, and also remarks that there was a lot of art there. Yeah. Several thank yous. A few people had to sneak away. I just made a note when you had mentioned the lootedart.com. I just put that into the chat box so people could see. Great. And I think we're ready for questions now. If I don't know whether you all would like to put your hand up and be recognized or just sort of shout it out. We're okay either way. I think we only have 20 participants at this point, so there's actually enough room to kind of maneuver. Who would like to jump in?
I had a question for Ken. It's not on the subject of this lecture. It's just sort of tangentially related. And that was, how do you feel about and what's getting done about the looting and sort of confiscation of spiritual and cultural artifacts from particularly First Peoples, like in the U.S. Right. In U.S. museums, and where do we stand on that with returning things? If you know, I know it's way off the subject.
Well, no, I mean it's certainly a related subject. You know, it reminds me of some of the conversations that went back a few years ago about how museums like the Smithsonian, you know, like in their basement, they have all of these sort of skulls and bones and things like that, which were just sort of taken as keepsakes from native peoples and native burial sites. And certainly it's been a slow process, but museums have been, in the US, have been more willing to return things, to say, you know, these bones should go back to where they came from and should be properly buried. And, you know, that's sort of one of the cases where, you know, it was clear that there was incredible insensitivity about, you know, disturbing burial sites and getting sort of little more than souvenirs. There wasn't even really serious scholarship going on there. So yeah, there's certainly been an openness to doing it and a willingness to do it. Is there, you know, someone sort of pressing ahead with this and, you know, taking the initiative and, you know, doing the pressure and resources and publicity. So a lot of the museums are oftentimes not, that's not one of their priorities. And actually I was gonna say, I really kind of miss going to museums, but yeah, it's not one of their priorities, but they're certainly more willing to do it and to say, okay, yes, we it's not right to hold on to these types of things. And in that case, there's not the kind of you know, sort of top tourist attraction that draws a lot of money that sometimes, you know, leads to, you know, reluctance to let things go. But in general, I mean, museums have, especially where there's a clear-cut claim, and again, that's a big if, on something that they're on a case-by-case basis are sort of willing to say, okay, you know, this, you know, we didn't do a good job here. And one of the examples I didn't get to talk about was from the Metropolitan Museum, where back in the, you know, even as late as the 80s, museums were not, when they purchased things, were not really doing a good job investigating them and researching them, which they should. And some of that though is on the auction sites, because sometimes they deal with shady characters and are, you know, again, just interested in the financial windfall. But yeah, museums weren't very good, again, until fairly recently in saying, okay, you know, where did this come from? And especially, where was it during World War II? Because then a lot of red flags start to come up.
Now, Ken, we have actually a pair of questions that have come in from Anne Briggs. Her first question is Britain's current position still that they should keep these looted artifacts because the countries from which they came from cannot care for them? It seems like a very condescending position. And then there's a second question, but maybe you'll start there. Okay,
yeah, that for a very long time, that was the sort of brush off statement. And it was very condescending. It's basically saying, you know, we have the technology, we have the state of the art museums, and we can take good care of it, and you can't. And so therefore, it's, you know, don't even ask. So yes, for a very long time, that was the common refrain. That's, you know, it's started to become less tenable. You know, like when, you know, Greece built their museum, and, you know, and the Egyptians are building their museum, and in Nigeria, they're building their museum. And so that's just not going to cut it anymore. And it's one thing, and it's certainly legitimate to say, you know, we should make sure these, you know, precious cultural artifacts are well taken care of, but it shouldn't be an offhand excuse.
The second question that Ian poses is, do you know about any movement or action at the political level in Britain that to sort of push for the return of the materials to their homes?
Right now it's, and certainly in even the last few years, although I think the museums have been sort of more willing to have discussions, particularly with other museums. The mood in the UK in the last few years has been sort of more inward looking, more sort of nationalistic. And so there hasn't been a lot of room for this sort of outward looking approach that, this is an international issue. So there hasn't been a lot of push on a political front there.
All right, and thank you. We have a question from Eniola. Eniola, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Ken. Thank you for this presentation. So I have a question about this looted artifacts, and I don't even want to use the word artifacts. What I found back a few years, not a few years, but a few weeks ago, was that the Smithsonian had sent me a link for, what is it? They wanted to raise money during the holidays with some type of bazaar or whatever, but it is actually a link to a site that has many artifacts and things for sale on it. And one thing that got to me as I typed in a particular thing was that some artwork that was made with like real skulls and bones from certain places kind of really turned me off. And I was like, what is this? They had stuff coming from places like New Guinea and other places, which was quite a shock. And I said, well, is this something that I need to speak to the Smithsonian about? That, they're using a site that allows vendors, and it was a particular vendor that almost everything they had was stuff that included body parts. I'm like, where did they get this stuff from?
Yeah, that's very strange, and I wouldn't think that would be even a good marketing ploy. But yeah, that's very bizarre.
It is, and Eniola, one thought is to go back and see if it says Smithsonian Institution, or if it says Smithsonian Magazine, which is a different entity altogether, or if it's someone else using the Smithsonian's name. I know that the institution would like to know more about this if you think that it's something that is out of place.
Yeah, it is the Smithsonian that is using a site, an auction site or something, to be able to sell things. And one of the sellers on that site is selling items that are artifacts that are made of human bones and remains. So,
yeah, that's definitely questionable, I have to say. I know that the Smithsonian, the collection of Native American bones and skulls that they have been pretty good about sending them back home. And the skeleton that they found, the fossilized skeleton that they found in the Columbia River, that has really been quite, what's the word I'm looking for? It has created controversy, but the Smithsonian actually was given a limited number of days to examine it before it was repatriated, if you will, sent back to the local tribe that felt that they had ownership. And so they did, as soon as they did the examination, did give it over. They did very extensive, photographs and testing. And there's a beautiful book written. I'll have to think for a moment the name of the researcher who did that. But it seems strange to me, this auction site that you're mentioning. If I could just separately say about the Smithsonian, you probably all know that it makes money on things like selling food and books and stuffed pandas and all the kinds of things that people buy when they go for visits, and they lose, I don't know what it is, several $1 million a week when they're shut down. So this has been profoundly terrible, the pandemic, for the Smithsonian and many, many other museums, especially the small museums across the United States and across the world, they've lost their income. And so I certainly wouldn't justify anything, but I would think that they're looking for alternate ways to generate revenue. And also separately, yet again, I will point out that at MC, we are not allowed to encourage students to go to the Smithsonian or other museums right now. They have reopened, but we are not doing field trips, and students may choose on their own what to do with their time. But we are currently not doing field trips because of the pandemic and because of concerns for safety, either, traveling or in a museum itself. But the Smithsonian is open, and I think if you read about what they're doing there, they've done a fine job to sort of figure out density, like how many people in the room, and they're doing time date stamping. Do we have, if we don't have another question right away, I had a question for Ken that is somewhat related. It's a little bit of a, if I will, not a dig, but a concern that, the fancy European museums are saying, we can take care of your stuff. But I think some of you know that there have been a rash of vandalism events in these lovely museums across Europe in the last number of weeks. And so the art isn't necessarily fully secure in those established museums. And I don't know if Ken, if you wanted to mention anything about what they're finding with oil smears and other things on some pretty terrific art.
Yeah, I haven't been up to date on that. I think you know more about it than I do right now. But whenever there is unrest, artworks are at risk, and they sometimes bear the brunt of that. For in this year it's been public monuments. And public monuments in a way are supposed to reflect what a society believed in. There's a consensus at a certain time, and certainly that's not true. Certainly not true in the U.S. anymore, and in a lot of other places. And monuments and statues, will be vandalized or destroyed. I mean, I'm not a big fan of destroying art, but I don't believe that removing statues is erasing history. It has nothing to do with it. Again, if in a community, if they don't agree that there should be monuments and public art, then that's something that has to be taken into account. And I do believe, and maybe it's heresy for an art historian, but I do think that people are more important than objects. Objects can be very powerful and inspiring, but I think about the Syrian archaeologist who stayed behind in Palmyra when ISIS took over the town. And I sort of respect his courage, or I don't know if he just couldn't bear to leave the art behind or wanted to talk them out of destroying it. But he's got tortured to death, and I just thought that was not didn't need to happen. And it's sad when incredible sites are destroyed. But I think saving human lives is more important than saving things. Although ideally we can have both.
I had a question about the tracing of historical objects and artworks, and how I'm sure that there are plenty that get lost. Like there are some that I'm sure are sitting in people's houses and they don't even know where it came from, or that it's historical in nature. But are there some that we have that we know came from a certain place in a certain time, but just don't know exactly how to trace it? And how do we end up tracing the ones that, could potentially be really hard to trace?
Yeah, I mean, that's in a way you sort of hit on sort of one of the big problems is, artworks like the one in, upstate New York, just in these quiet little museums for decades. And, you'd never know that there's something there that, has a questionable past, and it really has to come from, publicizing it. These gathering these databases, getting information out there, having exhibitions and publicizing things. But it has to really have an effect, it has to reach the level of major institutions, biggest museums and governments. They have to be willing to do it. Like I was talking before about the case in Poland, Polish government isn't really interested in saying, well, this really doesn't belong here and it should go back. And so if you have those kinds of roadblocks, you're not going to have a lot of movement. There has to be the research, there has to be the making information available, and people have to come together around artworks. But if you know of things, something about artworks, you can look at like one of the databases that I mentioned. You could ask at curators at some of the major museums, and things like that. But it starts with sort of one person noticing something.
Thank you, Daniel. I think we may be coming up at the end. Well, I would like to thank our guest presenter, Dr. Ken Jassie, who is an art historian at our Rockville campus. Thank you so much, Ken, for all that you have done.
Thank you. It was really good.
This research and presentation, so deep, so thoughtful, and actually, as you point out, this is so current. There will be a story in the next 2 weeks about another piece that people are wrestling over, and the longer it goes, the harder it will be to solve these. Thank you so much for all you've done.